Looks like people are mostly signed in. Well, I think we're going to go ahead and start. I want to thank you all for coming to our latest Fair Districts NC webinar. We do these every month on the fourth Wednesday at 5 o'clock. You know, we cover different aspects of redistricting, and we've been doing kind of a series on different states. We had Deb Wake, for example. Previously, we've had people from Pennsylvania. So, you know, we're definitely interested in the Utah experience, which is one of the states which, unlike us, unlike Virginia for that matter, has the ability to put something on the ballot. But still, that's not an easy thing to do, and Utah is also a very red state. So we're very glad to have with us two people representing the experience out there who can hopefully tell us how they did it and see what tips that we can pick up. And we have Gigi Brandt, who is the lead for redistricting for the Utah League of Women Voters, and has been involved in this for quite some time, longer, I think, than I've been a league member. Then we have Noah Rosenberg, who is the deputy director of Better Boundaries, which is their coalition nonprofit formed to bring about reform, and sort of a counterpart, although a much more developed counterpart, to our Fair Districts NC. And so I've come up with some questions, which I'm going to run through that we're all set up on here. So the first one really is that, since I'm sure that a lot of us on the call are not that familiar with Utah, much less their redistricting situation, I wonder if you could just give us an overview of the situation and how you got where you are and how the reform has played out. And I don't know who wants to go first. Either Gigi, Noah, who wants to go first?
I'll go first.
Okay, great.
The Utah League has had a position on a redistricting commission since 1980. We've had a long time. And I think that Noah and I agree that the stars were just right for this to happen. I don't know that it would ever happen. And Utah is a terrifically Republican state. In 2000, the redistricting for the congressional district was named, as the Wall Street Journal, I think, of one of the 5 most egregious or 4 most egregious in the country. And then 2010 came around, and I don't know whether things got better. Noah was a baby then. And finally, things just clicked for us to do it. Noah, you want to talk a little bit more? I mean, it's a terribly Republican state.
Yeah. So, I mean, just to give y'all some context, the last time we had an election for governor in 2016, the Democratic candidate got less than 28% of the vote statewide. And he spent more than any other Democratic candidate in the last 2 decades on that race for governor. So if that gives you an idea of how overwhelmingly one-sided our political system can be, we do have Democrats in the state legislature, but they're a super minority, meaning they're so small that even if they left, right, even if they get up and leave the chamber, they don't have enough numbers to break a quorum of the legislature in either chamber. And that, in many ways, was a blessing and a curse. I think it's sort of obvious why it might be a curse, right? That, like, the portion of people who feel traditionally disadvantaged by redistricting is very small in this state. But in many ways, it was also really helpful for us. As we got started in 2017 working on the ballot initiative, the biggest counter narrative to our effort was that this was all just a Democratic power grab, right? And we knew that was going to be the opposing talking point from the get-go. We had gone out of our way to have an organization that was very bipartisan, right? We had 4 campaign co-chairs, 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats, and we went out of our way in everything we did to be extremely bipartisan. But it was really the way in which the one-sided nature of our state really helped us was that in those scenarios when people would say, this is all just a power grab,
very much,
right?
Be able to hear.
It was easy for us to say, well, how could it be a Democratic power grab? There just aren't enough Democrats here to grab any power, right? So why would that be what we were working towards? So it sort of, it ended up being, you know, a double-edged sword for us. But overwhelmingly, we saw that when we had one-on-one conversations with voters, you could persuade them, which I think is not true on lots of other issues we think about, right? Lots of hot topics. When we think about things like the debates around abortion or the debates around gun control, right? It's really hard to sit one-on-one with another person and persuade them to your way of thinking. And that wasn't our experience with redistricting at all, right? Most people didn't have a strongly entrenched opinion on redistricting, besides or beyond the fact that maybe it might help or hurt their own political party, but not really all that much in Utah. And so we were really able to make the argument that voters should be accountable to their, or pardon me, politicians should be accountable to their voters. And that really resonated here in a way that I think we also saw in other states across the country as well in 2018.
Yeah, we definitely see that here when we talk to voters. I think accountability and the fact that voters should be able to hold their politicians accountable is really an argument that appeals across the board, you know, regardless of their party affiliation. So yeah, so that's yeah, that's great. So how you guys put something on the ballot in 2018 and actually had drafted the full bill, and you guys had negotiated that out on the coalition, as I understand it. But how did that process work?
So going back to when Better Boundaries first started, there had been other redistricting efforts in the past. There was one just before the 2010 redistricting called, I think, Fair Boundaries. Gigi, you can correct me. Okay.
Yeah, it's Fair Boundaries.
And in Utah, we have the ability to put an initiative on the ballot, which an initiative just edits a portion of state code, right? So it's not as strong as a constitutional amendment that would prevent the legislature from coming back and making changes, but it is a pathway for citizens to make laws themselves without the approval of the legislature. So in 2017, in summer of 2017, our group started under the premise that we were either going to get things done in 2018 or it would really be too late for that initiative path to work. Because in order for the initiative to run through the whole process, you spend almost a year gathering signatures from 10% of voters in the state. And then you have to go to a full election, right? So that'll be in either a midterm or a presidential year. And so for us, the timing was just right that in 2017, we would qualify for the ballot in late 2017, early 2018, and then get on the ballot in 2018, and then persuade voters and win in November. But in the course of that, we did a lot of different kinds of voter contact, right? We did voter contact that was not directly face-to-face, right? We did digital advertising campaigns, we ran TV ads, we ran radio ads, we had a whole like earned media campaign in our state's 2 daily newspapers and with our state's news television stations. But we also, the one thing that I think really helped the most was having to go out and gather, we gathered 190,000 signatures from voters in the state to actually get on the ballot in the first place. And that sort of face-to-face voter contact is a real opportunity to have those one-on-one conversations where people don't, it's not, right, it's not a debate because the opposing argument is not being made in that moment. It's not TV where people think, you know, like believe half of what you hear and none of what you see on TV, right? It was an opportunity to really have our canvassers go one-on-one and convince people, and those people overwhelmingly then continued to support the ballot initiative, even if they were folks that we had just passed in a parking lot at a grocery store, right, and said, hey, would you please sign this thing? They overwhelmingly were able to say, you know, oh yeah, I remember that. I remember you guys met me in the grocery store parking lot, and I remember it had something to do with redistricting, and I thought it was good. The canvasser explained it well. I think that had we not, at the time that voter contact seemed really laborious, right? It took a lot of effort to gather 190,000 signatures. And it seemed like really just an unnecessary hurdle that the legislature had put in our way. But again, I think this is an example of a double-edged sword, right? The legislature forced us to go this path because they thought it would be too hard for anyone to do, right? They had created this threshold because they thought it was going to be too difficult for any initiative to qualify, right? But in the end, what it ultimately meant was it forced our initiative to really solidify our base of grassroots support in a way that we wouldn't necessarily have done if we didn't have such a high threshold for signatures.
Yeah, I've really noticed that here. I mean, I think in states, although it's a huge task to get done, and there are currently several states that are really struggling because of COVID, and the courts have not permitted them to collect signatures electronically. As far as I don't think there are any that have permitted that, as far as I know. Could be wrong, but I do think that it provides something very concrete that people can do, to take action and to move reform forward. Which so it really, like you say, I think in some ways, despite the huge logistical challenge that it poses, I think it's an advantage in organizing. I mean, we can ask people to, contact their legislators or let their friends and neighbors know, come to an educational event, but it's not the same as being able to, rack up more signatures and get on the ballot directly.
Right.
Well, that's yeah. Thanks a lot. I think that gives people, a pretty good idea of how you guys got going for sure. So in addition to the accountability argument, what did you find was the most effective way to reach out to people? What were the arguments that appealed especially to conservatives? I mean, I think at this point support on the liberal side in North Carolina is pretty strong, on the Republican side, of those who have an opinion, they support redistricting reform 3-1, but there are a lot of people who say they're unsure on the polls.
Right. So I think, let me talk about what the arguments we used for persuading more conservative and moderate voters, but I do think there's also a lot of important messaging to be used with more liberal voters. It's just very different from what you would use when talking to a conservative voter. So like I said, right, the whole voters should pick their politicians, not the other way around. That was the most effective messaging. Accountability was probably the second most effective set of messaging, right? That like when an elected official is allowed to choose their voters, they don't have to listen to those voters, or they can ignore certain chunks of their voters because they know that they'll never have any accountability, right? So a good example of this, and maybe Gigi can talk about this, but right in the middle of our signature gathering effort, there was a congressman who had a town hall. Gigi, did you want to talk about this?
Yeah, are you talking about Stewart?
Yeah.
Yes, he came out in Salt Lake City, and he came out and he said, I don't have to listen to you. You people don't vote for me. And so it's great that I'm here to let you listen. And I think it turned off. And I think partly the other thing Noah says is, even though we have an overwhelmingly Republican legislature, they are not very popular. Most of them. They're not popular when you interview them, but when they go to the ballot box, they vote for them still. And there just were a number of things. And that legislators had treated other citizen groups rather rudely at times in meetings, and I think Noah's right that you could really home in on the fact that sometimes they didn't listen.
I think, right, the notion that your elected official knows in advance that they don't have to listen to you, right, is really repugnant to most voters, whether that's the politician is of their party or not. Right? Like, I think people on both sides of the political spectrum, by and large, view politicians as their employees, right? They work for us. And so to hear someone say, well, you didn't vote for me last election, and I know you won't be voting for me again this election, so I don't care what you have to say, that's a real affront that people feel like viscerally angry about. I think the other key component of our messaging to conservative and more moderate voters was choosing the right messenger, right? Oftentimes it's not just what you're saying, it's who's saying it. We were very fortunate that President Ronald Reagan has a whole slew of excellent quotes about redistricting reform. We cut one of them into a great TV ad where Ronald Reagan says word for word, right? Like, gerrymandering is wrong, and I think that the redistricting process should be handled by an independent bipartisan commission every 10 years so that voters choose their politicians, right? He says that almost word for word, and that really helped us because it's one thing to have regular folks who are maybe from a totally different part of the state say something in the newspaper in an op-ed or an editorial, right? It's another thing to see someone who you know and respect say, 30 years ago, oh yeah, this was a problem 30 years ago. We hated it in California. It was dumb then and it's dumb now and it should change, right? Like it's really critical. So to the extent that you can find either living like local ambassadors, right? Well-known folks within the community that can act as your surrogate, or people throughout history that have really high, name recognition, right? That when someone like President Reagan is mentioned, everybody sits up and pays attention because that's a president that they remember from their lifetime as being, having attributes or characteristics they enjoyed.
Yeah, no, he's the latest poll I've seen on views towards politicians show that he is the most admired politician, even more than former Governor Hunt, who's on the Dem side, is very high, but is a very highly regarded former governor, still living. Okay, well that's yeah. I think Gigi, do you have anything in terms of what the league did on messaging that you thought was effective or other?
No, we really deferred. We decided late from the beginning that we all should speak as one voice, and so the league is considered in Utah wrongly, but they're considered as a liberal organization. And so it was better that Better Boundaries with its broad coalition speak than it was very hard for us sometimes to stand back, but it, we looked at it as we're going to accomplish this. But we had a long history of talking about redistricting, and so that it was somewhat familiar to our members and to other people.
I do think so. One area that I think is important to touch on is how to talk to people who are supportive of redistricting reform, but maybe are not very hopeful about, a particular effort. I can tell you, I get this question still to this day, right? I get opposition from people who think that, what we're doing now doesn't matter, that it won't make a difference, that the initiative didn't go far enough. And throughout, right, whether we were trying to get on the ballot or whether we were on the ballot and trying to persuade voters, I had people tell me over and over and over again, well, it just can't be done. So I don't even know why you're trying. Like it's impossible, right? And truly, if I had a nickel for every time someone told me that what we were doing was impossible, I would not have had to fundraise a dime for this $3 million project, right? I think it's really important that when you meet people who are sort of more predisposed to be passionate about redistricting reform, but when they think it's impossible, I think the really important thing is to remind them that everything seems impossible until the first group does it, right? Everything seems impossible until somebody decides to try and succeeds, and then it doesn't seem impossible anymore, right? And it's really easy to give up hope, and it's really easy to say, nothing I do like by myself can make a difference. But if you believe that, then like nothing will ever change. Right? And this is true not just in redistricting, but in everything in politics, right? Yeah. If nobody ever tries, nothing will ever change, right? I think another argument that I found really helpful was the notion that the people who believe in gerrymandering are the bad guys, right? And not standing up and not trying to do something about gerrymandering in our state is letting the bad guys win without ever putting up a fight, right?
Yeah, we have the advantage in a way that both the Democrats and Republicans have gerrymandered the state, up one side of the hill and down the other. I mean, the Democrats gerrymandered really all the way back to create safe seats for themselves initially, and then when Republicans became a thing after the civil rights reforms, then they started gerrymandering and really gerrymandered very badly. And of course, in Maryland and other states, there have been Democratic Party gerrymanders. So that's something where people really see that both sides do it. But the people say, but you can't change this, you can't change it. We're very happy that Virginia has really broken through, and although they don't have referendum and have a very complex process of having to get their legislature to vote for the exact same amendment in two successive legislatures with an election in between, they were able to do it, and they will go on the ballot and, knock wood, should be able to get that through in Virginia. And that is the first state in the South to create a real commission. It's not an independent commission, in that the map still will go to the legislature, but the legislature cannot amend. And that is, so it's a very strong reform. And to get that, half of the commission is sitting legislators who are named by the leadership, which is sort of the way you do that. But it's a solid reform, and really the best that you can probably get in a state in that situation. And New York also in 2014 is the only other state where the legislature has again creating an advisory commission rather than an independent commission, but did create it, and it ratified by the voters, and will be used for the first time next year. So it can be done. So we're always glad. We're mostly talking to people who've succeeded for obvious reasons.
Well, and it's not, redistricting isn't a one size fits all issue, right? Like it's not something where you can just take the commission that works in California and like copy paste it onto 49 other states, right? You have to find a method that really works for the communities where you live, right? And so an advisory commission might be, the most workable solution this decade. That doesn't mean that next decade or the decade after that, once people are really comfortable with an advisory commission, that things don't continue to progress towards a binding commission. I think it's just really important to note that don't let perfect be the enemy of the good, right? Don't be self-defeatist because like what you can get feasibly in your state might not be your perfect solution, right? But any progress is better than no progress. And so in the course of doing the work, in the course of building that effort, you're also going to meet people and make connections and build the resources you'll need to do more in the future, right? Every single thing we do is an opportunity for organizing.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. And of course, as you were saying too, I mean, having a broad coalition is so important, but that can also cause problems of people having different viewpoints or being not necessarily so friendly in other contexts. So what were some of the challenges that you had to overcome to get your coalition together and to hold it together?
I think the first meetings in 20 before, actually after the election in 2016, that was the group that coalesced out of the other group. There were several people that just left, and they said, well, this is just a bunch, we don't like this, and we left. And I know that Noah and Catherine reached out to them, but they weren't persuadable. As to Noah's last argument, one of the arguments I found when talking with Republicans was that I'd say, well, in gerrymandering, it's the politicians, it's Democrats that make deals to save their seats, just as it is Republicans, and that's why it's really important that we have a commission.
I think one thing that's really important to keep in mind is that not everyone will agree in any organization, right? Not everyone will agree with a particular course. I think the biggest opposition we had in Utah, it actually wasn't like a political ideology breakdown, right? It wasn't like the Republicans thought we should do one thing and the Democrats thought we should do a different thing. It was that there was a group of people within our coalition who really thought that the angle we should be pursuing with the money we were raising was to sue at the federal level and join, Gill v. Whitford, the Benesek case in Maryland, right? They thought that the Supreme Court was the path, right? And it's not that they thought the initiative was a waste of time. It's that they thought it would be cheaper and faster to just go straight to the Supreme Court. We didn't agree, and we were willing to put in the work to build a ballot initiative. And ultimately, about half of the way through our campaign, the Supreme Court came down and said, no, we're not going to give the federal courts the ability to remedy political gerrymandering. And so like all of those people were proven wrong. And that will sometimes happen, right? And sometimes you'll pick the wrong course, right? I could just as easily have ended up on the other side of that argument. I think the thing that's really important though is when that happens, when those naysayers are proven wrong, right? Every time someone has told you you can't do it, and then you do the thing they said you couldn't do, that's an opportunity to go back to them and re-engage them and bring them back into the movement, right? And remind them that they thought it was impossible. And not like, hey, you thought it was impossible and I did it, so ha ha ha, right? But like, hey, remember when you thought this was impossible? I just showed you it's possible. Come back and help me do the next impossible thing, right? Like clearly the things that you thought were impossible might not be. Let's go do some work, right? And I think when that happens, the hardest part about building a coalition, right, is keeping people together and on the same page. And there were so many groups in our coalition, right? People from the League of Women Voters to, right, ACLU of Utah, to national groups. I mean, we had labor unions from the West Coast who said, you're not in our region. We don't have any members in your state, but we understand that like this is important work. And so we're going to choose to help you out. And anytime you build a coalition, I think the big keys are transparency with your stakeholders, right? Be really clear about what we're doing to advance our goals at any given moment, and be really clear about having a consensus on those goals, right? Don't midway through the project decide, oh, well, let's tack on, redistricting is very connected to voting rights. But if the whole coalition doesn't really want to work on voting rights or voter protection or voter access, maybe that's worth exploring having a second group that's set up that has only a portion of your coalition working on it, rather than trying to get this same group to also do that work that might cause people to peel away, right? The groups in your coalition don't have to be allies on every single piece of policy. They just have to be allies on this one thing, right?
Yeah, that's real good advice. I mean, I think we were also the League of Women Voters in North Carolina, together with Common Cause. Our two cases were joined, were the ones that went to the Supreme Court and went down. But I, in fact, always held a somewhat bizarre minority opinion, which was that it wouldn't matter if the Supreme Court ruled in our favor, because they would still draw gerrymanders. Because, I mean, the racial gerrymanders have been officially unconstitutional since the late 80s. And the last bit of racial gerrymandering to date was removed by a court from the legislative maps in 2018.
Yes.
So, and that's just because they haven't had a chance to draw another one. So it doesn't matter. I mean, I know that's a kind of a weird way to say it, but especially without, the way the Voting Rights Act is now, that you have to wait for to show the impact before you can sue. We're really, the court is not the solution. We need to get change here, legislative change, or an amendment if possible, but more likely a legislative solution. So tell me, I know maybe people would be interested in the actual process that you ended up having to go through to negotiate with the legislature after the voters, indeed, not by a large margin, by 5,000 votes or something, approved the, but still win, approved the referendum. And then, so then what happened? Maybe you guys can tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so in that whole timeline, right, we qualified for the ballot and we were on the ballot in November of 2018. We passed the ballot very narrowly. We had 50.3% of the vote. So we passed by a little less than 7,000 votes. And on one hand, that meant that many of our legislators who were not friendly to us from the get-go could come back and say, well, see, there weren't that many people. They don't have a real mandate. And so, we don't necessarily have to do what they want, right? It wasn't overwhelming support. And that was really funny to me because throughout our entire political campaign, legislators would say, well, this is just post-election sour grapes by a bunch of Democrats who lose by a handful of votes and are upset that they lose. And after that election, when legislators would say, well, this is just, see, they didn't win by very much. What I wanted to say was, well, this is just post-election sour grapes by a bunch of legislators who lost. But because in Utah, a ballot initiative just amends our state code, once the initiative passes, the legislature can go back in and edit the code, just like they can any other section of code, right? Every year in the legislative session, they pass a bill that says, you have to stop at stop signs. And then the next year they could go back and pass a bill that says, oh, just kidding, never mind. You don't have to stop at stop signs ever again, right? They can just go back and change any piece of state code. We were very, very fortunate because in the same 2018 election, there were two other initiatives that were on the ballot with us. One that expanded Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act that included like a dedicated sales tax levy to do so, and one that legalized medical marijuana. Those two initiatives were so controversial compared to ours that they sucked all of the oxygen away from us in the election. And then they did the same thing after the election as well. So from the day that the election was held, the legislature spent about a week with medical marijuana theoretically being legal under the law before they held a special session in November of 2018 to repeal large sections of that legalization. And then in the legislative session, which would be from January to March of 2019, right? So 4 or 5 months after the election, they had another bill that neutered the expansion of Medicaid under the ACA. And so in a lot of ways, we were unfortunate as like human beings that live in this state to have that happen. But from a redistricting reform perspective, we were pretty fortunate. And let me explain why. The public had already reacted so angrily to the rollback of medical marijuana legalization and the rollback of Medicaid expansion. And then in that legislative session, the legislature passed some changes to the tax code that were going to go into effect that were so offensive to people on both sides of the political aisle that they started a referendum. So a referendum similar to an initiative. I don't know if do you have referenda in North Carolina? Okay, so an initiative creates new law in the state code that's made by voters. A referendum does a similar thing. It just repeals a law that the legislature passes. So voters ran a referendum to repeal those changes to the state tax code right before the 2020 general session of our legislature. So going into that session, we knew we were going to have to negotiate with legislators, but our sort of ace in the hole was that the legislature had already made the voters so mad that they knew they could only go so far, right? Which was not their attitude the previous year. Their attitude the previous year was, we'll talk to you, sure, and if we can find a compromise, great, but if not, we'll just steamroller you, right? We'll just do what we want, and you guys can just, deal with it. In 2020, they had some of that same attitude, and they pressed even stronger because I think with the redistricting looming closer, it was more clear to them what the consequences of having an independent commission would be than it had been the year before. But I also think they were more afraid. And even at one point when our negotiations broke down, right, we were quick to say negotiations have broken down and the legislature plans to fully repeal the ballot initiative. And the outcry from the public was huge and overwhelming in that moment. And it brought the legislature back to the table, right? It took a weekend of anger and, letters to their legislators,